Hi, this is Veronica Brill. I'm a registered nurse and I'm the founder of Blenderized RN. This is an updated new version of Blended Diets 101. This video is made for people just starting to learn how to make a blended diet for their child or the person they care for. In this video, we'll discuss blended diets that go through the G tube and the J tube. That's me with my son D, and there's his gastric tube. A quick overview before we get started. We'll talk about the right and the wrong way to blend. We'll also talk about the tools you'll need to be successful blending. We'll talk about some goals that you should be setting for your child and yourself, and how to transition to a blended diet. We'll discuss the different types of blending that you can do, and I'll give you some ideas with sample blends. And as usual, constipation is always an issue when transitioning to a blended diet, especially within the first month. And we'll talk about the weight loss that you might encounter with your child when switching over. And then we'll talk about some volume issues. One of the biggest misconceptions that parents and caregivers have is that there is a right and a wrong way of blending. There actually is no right or wrong way of blending. There is only proper food preparation. What works for one child may not necessarily work for another, so take some stress off yourself and try not to overcomplicate things. And remember, you're not trying to recreate formula, you're trying to blend food like a typical child would eat. To do a blended diet properly, you'll need the right tools. An industrial grade blender is probably one of the most important tools that you will need to be successful. Either a Blend Tech or a Vitamix will work just fine. Keep in mind that the BlendTech blenders come in a wide jar option, and Vitamix has wide and slim jar options. The slim jar options will be beneficial to you if you'd like to make smaller portions. The blender I had for D was the Vitamix 5200. I used it up to 5 times a day for my own personal use, plus blending his diet, and I never had a single issue with it. If you're planning on doing bolus feeds through the gastric tube, you may want to purchase some Miracle O-ring syringes from the squirrel store. They can be cleaned with just warm soap and water, and they can last for years if taken care of properly. Just make sure you put a little bit of oil on the rubber after they're dry. Remember that bolus feeding should only be done through the G tube and not the J tube. Most people that start blended diets are used to feeding their child through the pump, because that's how formula is typically given to a child. If you feel comfortable with this, you can continue to feed your child through the pump. You'll just need to get yourself an infinity pump. This pump works best with blended diets. Kangaroo was talking about coming out with a blended diet pump, but it's been quite a while now and I still have heard nothing. You may need to modify your bag to use the infinity pump, and here's a sample of what you would need to do. And you can also feed through the G and the J through the pump. And again, remember that you cannot bolus feed through the J. Your supply company will probably give you 2 to 4 extensions a month. It's easy to keep them clean. Just wash them with warm soapy water. There are 2 different kinds of extensions, and I prefer the one shown here with the double port or the Y port. One port is for larger syringes, and the other smaller port they call the medication port, but it's just the same thing, just a smaller port. The other type of extension is called a bolus extension, where you just have one large opening for either pump tubing or a large syringe. You will need some items to store your blends, and I love ball glass jars. You can get them in many different sizes. I like to store 6 to 8 ounce individual portions in them and keep them in the fridge. Blends do not last as long as typical food, so if you're planning on keeping it for more than 2 days, I would recommend freezing it. And it's a good idea to keep some Ziploc freezer bags around. I like to freeze in individual portions. Now that you have the tools needed to start a blended diet, let's talk about setting some goals. Make sure you set some realistic goals that you and your child can meet. Setting a goal of big batch blending a week after starting blended diets may not be achievable. A realistic goal could be that you're going to find a few foods that your child tolerates very well and slowly add variety. If your child is vomiting a lot from formula, a good goal may be to find a few foods that don't make your child vomit. A word of caution about children that have vomiting problems while on formula. Most children actually have a lot of problems digesting formula, and in those cases, I would recommend a quick transition of a few days to a blended diet. In most cases, vomiting will stop as soon as a blended diet is introduced and the formula is completely out of the diet. If the gut bacteria has been very compromised from the high sugar formula diet, it may take up to a month for the vomiting to stop. Your first week is the transition week, and I know it's going to be difficult, but do not worry about calories. Your goal is to find foods that your child tolerates. I recommend starting a food diary and taking notes on the foods that you try and how your child tolerates them. By week 2, you should be reaching your calorie goals. You should try to increase the volume if necessary, and keep in mind when children switch to a blended diet, they tend to be able to tolerate more volume than when they were on formula. During the second week, you may want to start considering setting a more normal schedule for your child. Start thinking about feedings more like breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. This will make feedings feel more like a meal instead of a hospitalized medical treatment. Also, during the second week, it would be a good idea to start probiotics. You can get probiotics over the counter at a pharmacy, or you can buy your own natural probiotics. If you're choosing the over-the-counter method from the pharmacy, then take as directed. Otherwise, you can just give about 5 ml after a couple of meals a day. Once this good bacteria is introduced into the digestive tract, digestion and immunity might improve. Next, I'll give you some skeleton recipes that you can use as a guide to reach your daily goals, and they're brought to you by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Just pause the video when you get to your age group or when you get to your calorie goals per day. These nutrient goals are given as a guideline for parents of typical children that have a typical weight. If your child falls in a lower percentile for their weight, or is inactive due to a medical condition, you do not have to reach their typical age goals. Just find the calories that your GI recommends for them and reach those goals. One thing I'd like you to consider is that it may be difficult to reach your milk and dairy goals due to volume issues, and it might be good to consider a calcium and vitamin D3 supplement instead. If you don't know how many calories your child needs, I'm going to show you how to do it. First, you take their weight in pounds and divide it by 2.2, which makes kilograms. Then you can use this chart to tell you how many calories your child will need throughout the day. For example, if your child is 2 years old and weighs 18 pounds, you would divide that by 2.2, which would be 8.2 kilograms. Based on this chart, a 2-year-old would need 75 to 90 calories per kilogram per day. So we would multiply 75 by 8.2 kilograms and 90 by 8.2 kilograms. And based on this chart, our 2-year-old will need between 615 and 738 calories a day. If your child is inactive, I would go towards a 615 calories a day, and if your child is very active, I would move more towards the 738 calories a day. And if you'd like to know how much fluid your child needs based on their weight, find their weight in pounds in the column, and to the right, you'll see how much fluid is recommended for them a day. Based on this chart, a 21-pound child would need about 950 milliliters of fluid a day. Remember, that's total fluids per day. Your blend should be considered about 70 to 80% water, so make sure you count that towards your daily fluid amounts. And make sure you meet your child's recommended amount of calcium and vitamin D a day. If you're interested in feeding your child bolus meals, it will vary depending on their weight and age. Remember, these are just guidelines. Don't stress if your child doesn't reach these goals. 1-year-olds should have about 4 to 6 ounces per meal, 2 to 3-year-olds about 5 to 8 ounces, and 4 to 8-year-olds more than 5 ounces, and 9 to 19 greater than 6 ounces. If your child is having difficulties with volume, just give it some time and slowly work up to some of these amounts. Now let's talk about the actual transition. Again, if your child is having a lot of reflux and vomiting from formula, I recommend a fairly quick transition. The night before you start the transition, make a pot of bone broth so it'll be ready in the morning. And the night before, you can also stop night feeds if you are comfortable. On day 1, you're going to replace the first meal with just a clear bone broth. If you're normally giving them 3 to 4 ounces of formula, then give your child 3 to 4 ounces of the clear bone broth. If your child is tolerating this, blend up some chicken, carrots with the clear bone broth and give them this blend for their next meal. If your child is tolerating this, replace the rest of their meals with this blend. If you haven't stopped the night feeds, I would stop them at this point if you feel comfortable and if your child is tolerating all of the feeds. On day 2, take the blend and start adding some avocado or any other items that you feel comfortable adding. I usually say get to a full blend by the end of the week, and I usually recommend starting up dairy and gluten-free at least for the first few weeks. If you're not comfortable with this quick of a transition, by all means take your time and do it over a week or over a month, however you feel comfortable or however is recommended by your doctor. Here is my bone broth recipe. My mother initially taught me how to make bone broth, and she made hers on the stovetop for 2 hours, but I've really loved the bone broth on the slow cooker overnight. You can add your own herbs. I prefer dill, and you can use this recipe for any type of poultry as long as you're using bones that have marrow. If you'd like to do a beef bone broth, just use beef bones that have marrow and cook for 24 hours. Once you start getting into a blenderized diet world, you'll realize there are different blending types. In my Blenderized RN Facebook group, Jennifer Browning Batts coined the phrase from the table to the blender. This is an ideal place to be as a blending parent because then you can just make a meal, take a little bit of it, and blend it for your child. Not everyone can blend every single meal separately, so you can become a daily blender. You put all of your ingredients in for the entire day, blend it, and separate it into meals. This is what the majority of my clients do. There are also big batch blenders that can blend up meals for an entire month. I recommend this to be a more long-term goal. And then there's a mixture of different blending types. I would often make a big batch of my son's base, that would be bone broth and chicken, but I would make all of his fresh ingredients that same day. I want you to see that blending doesn't have to be complicated. This is a sample blend of a meal. It's just chicken, sweet potato, carrot, quinoa, a handful of spinach, and some milk to blend. And you can see the breakdown of it in this pie chart. I also want to give you a sample of a daily blend. I've made it 1,000 calories so that it's easy for you to use regardless of the amount of calories you need. If you need a 600 calorie diet, you can just multiply all of the amounts by 0.6 and it'll end up being 600 calories. If you need a 1,200 calorie blend, just multiply everything by 1.2 and it'll be a 1,200 calorie blend. Here is the ratio for this blend. The only thing I would recommend is adding a multivitamin and about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt a day, and calcium and vitamin D as recommended by your doctor. The transition from breast milk or formula to a blended diet for some children can be difficult because of the increase in protein and fiber. I could almost guarantee that your child will become constipated, and constipation is a major cause of reflux and vomiting. If it does become a problem, you can increase water, and you can also do a constipation massage that follows the large intestine. Before starting the blended diet, I highly recommend that you visit your pediatrician and let them know that you're starting your child on a blended diet and you will be anticipating some constipation. It usually takes about a month for poops to get back to normal. Another thing to be prepared for is some weight loss. It shouldn't be a lot, and depending on the child's weight, it could be ounces, and for a larger child, maybe even a pound. But don't panic, it's very common. It may take 2 to 4 months for your child to start gaining weight on a blended diet. If you'd like to read more on this, Dr. Bass has a great article on it on his website. Again, I highly recommend that you speak to your child's doctor and ask how much weight loss is okay. Many children have volume issues while on formula, but these tend to be resolved after switching to a blended diet. If not, I would allow time for digestion to happen. Wait maybe 4 to 5 or even 6 hours in between meals. If your child is extremely slow to digest, I would recommend trying a plant-based diet since it's quite easy to digest. You could also try giving the majority of the fluids in between meals. Adding a few high-calorie items that can boost calories will help. And consider the use of powders. There are fruit and vegetable powders out there, even hemp powder. I would say long term I wouldn't want to leave my child on just fruit and vegetable or hemp powder, but it's good during the transition. Try to make sure that your child is having daily poops that are peanut butter textured, and if anything is still a problem, make sure you see your GI. If you have any questions, you can visit my website, blenderizedrn.com, or join our Facebook group where thousands of blending parents and caregivers are discussing blending ideas. And while you're in our Facebook group, make sure you say hello to our Blenderized RN family. Jennifer Browning Batts, Leslie Benz, and Jill Stickhouse.